social injustice, better known as Exchange for Change. So I'm your host, Candace Price, Materion's very own campus and diversity talent acquisition specialist. I'm based out of the Mayfield Heights location, but I'm currently working from home. Today, I'm also going to be representing the United Voices of Materion. And some of you may or may not have heard of us, but we are a small but mighty group of about 7 employees from various locations all across the company. We're very passionate about diversity and inclusion within Materion and within our local communities. And we believe that through thoughtful, impactful conversations to help create awareness, acceptance, and allyship, we collectively ensure that all Materion employees are in an environment that supports their well-being to really be yourself. We're honored to have our president of A&M, Leo Linehan, as our executive sponsor. You may have seen our podcast a few weeks ago. It was aired about late March on Materion Matters. So maybe if you missed it, you can still go back and check it out. Perhaps you have read about Materion's diversity and inclusion and the other employee resource groups that are new to Materion kind of come to life over the last year or so. Those have all been featured in articles between 2020 and now. So those are still available for your reference. Maybe you heard about United Voices of Materion when we promoted the National Day of Racial Healing that aired in January on YouTube. It's actually still available on YouTube for those who have not had a chance to check it out. Maybe today is your first time hearing about United Voices of Materion at all. Whatever brought you to this moment, we hope that you are left curious to learn more and inspired to spur change in your community. And today's guest is going to help me do just that. So you've seen her picture in all of the communications about Exchange for Change. You've seen the highlights about her career and her accomplishments, but Danielle Sydnor is far more than just the information on this slide. As president of the Cleveland branch of the NAACP, she's going to help us learn about the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She's going to share with us some strategies, some trends that she's seen, some ideas that we can take with us and action steps that we can do on our own to help make our communities and our workplaces better. Let's hear from Danielle herself as she tells us a little bit about who she is and how she first became involved with the NAACP. Danielle, welcome to the Exchange.
Candace, thank you so much for asking me to participate, and to all of the other members of the United Voices of Materion and everybody who's on the call and will see this presentation in the future. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, as Candace mentioned, my name is Danielle Sydnor, and I am the president for the Cleveland branch of the NAACP. I also have a consulting practice called We Win Strategies Group, where I really work to try and help organizations that are trying to grapple with the intersections of race and economics and thinking about how we create more access and economic opportunity for disadvantaged groups. But how I became involved in the NAACP is actually in 2012, I had a client. At the time I was a financial advisor with Merrill Lynch. I had a client that I was working with, and we were exchanging information about a number of things. And then I got an email one day saying, send me your address and your phone number and this information. I'm buying you a membership to the NAACP. You need to come to this meeting. And so I was very familiar with the organization. My great aunt, who is now 85, she would hate that I told you her age, but I think it's impressive, is still on the national board of the NAACP. She was, up until December of last year, the president for the California and Hawaii State Conference. My grandmother at one point in time was the president for the Sandusky NAACP when she lived in Ohio, and then also in Cleveland. So my family has been committed to social justice for as long as I can remember, but my connectivity really came through trying to find a place to serve and really being able to offer what I was doing in the world of finance in the world of social justice, because a lot of times people think racial equity and trying to heal the issues of systemic racism and oppression and disparity are only about marching and protesting and voting, but really it's trying to close gaps all across the different industries where we see disparities. And so I encourage people, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit more during our conversation, Candace, but I always encourage people to think about what you're good at today, and you can likely identify a way that you can be serving in your community or in an organization, helping to elevate whatever that organization is trying to accomplish relative to your skill set. You don't generally have to find something new in order to be able to serve. Just apply what you already are doing in your professional world, in the world of social justice, and you can have a tremendous impact.
That's a great idea. I love that. Absolutely. Now, for those who may be unfamiliar with the NAACP, how would you describe the organization's purpose, their goals in present day times?
Yeah, so I would say our goals in present day times actually have not changed a lot. What you'll see that's different is maybe the way that we execute and work towards achieving our goals. So really at its foundation, our mission is to eliminate race-based discrimination wherever it may exist. And that's why we're involved in so many different sectors. We're focusing on housing, we're focusing on education, health disparities, environmental and climate justice is also a big thing that we focus on. And so the goals that we have, yes, over time have evolved, because if you think about the foundation and the history of the NAACP, was initially created as a result of increased lynchings in Illinois, and a group of people, multiracial people, got together and said, we've got to do something about this. We cannot continue to tolerate this really government-sanctioned violence against Black folks continuing to be lynched without anybody having, being held responsible for it. So today, we don't necessarily see a result of lynching of why we're doing our work, but when you look at incidences like the death of George Floyd and the issues that we're still having across the country, we have issues that are really big in front of us that you need organizations that are as broad as the NAACP, having over 2,000 chapters or branches is what we call them across the country. We have an opportunity to be active in so many different places and trying to affect change broadly.
And that's great. That's really good to hear all of the different types of areas that the NAACP has been able to branch out to, especially coming from such gruesome and horrible tragedy to start. So I think that's amazing, but I really want to dig into the meat of our conversation. Okay. So I believe that this is Materion's first time ever doing anything like this before. But this isn't your first time engaging with businesses, having these in-depth conversations, having these really hard, sometimes hard to hear conversations. So tell us, from your experience, what are some of the challenges or some of the trends that you have seen from other employers and employees related to diversity and inclusion topics?
So Candace, I think I'll start with my time in corporate America and kind of evolve to where the conversations that I'm having today. When I was working at Bank of America, I had an associate that on my team that came to me and said, Bank of America has these things. Well, first, let me back up. We were at MBNA initially, and then Bank of America bought us, so we were together because of a merger. But through that acquisition, Bank of America had these things called employee resource groups. And MBNA didn't have employee resource groups. We were a smaller credit card operation. So I had a staff member that came to me and said she wanted to inquire about doing this. And so as I attempted to try and investigate how we might start a Black professionals group in our Cleveland office for Bank of America, I initially had to go find out how many Black associates there were on campus. And so I talked to a white male colleague who was like an area manager or whatever the title might have been at the time. And he told me he couldn't share that information with me because it was proprietary information. And I was a little taken aback. I'm like, well, this is like a company-wide sanctioned activity. And so if this is what the bylaws say, I have to find out how many employees. The organization must be comfortable with somebody being able to share that. And so that was one of my first introductions to thinking about how difficult it can be for folks who are not used to talking about race to just be kind of smack dab in the middle of trying to bring about something that's new and different, especially when you're introducing something new to an organization. He was not familiar with Black Professionals Group. He wasn't familiar with a lot of the employee resource groups that Bank of America had, because we were all legacy MBNA employees. Fast forward to where we are today, I think if we look at the conversations that are happening broadly in society, it actually does make it easier to have conversations inside of organizations. It doesn't make it less difficult, but I think the platform has been created for more employers to feel that it's okay to talk about these things in the workplace. For so long, we were told there are certain things that are just taboo. You don't talk about politics, you don't talk about religion, you don't talk about money, you don't talk about sex, gender, race. You just come bring as much of yourself, but don't talk about that other stuff. And so now that we're in an environment where people feel like I should be able to show up as my full self. And if something happens like the murder of George Floyd, I can't just continue to go to work like nothing happened. I remember the day that Philando Castile was killed in Minneapolis, and I accidentally watched that. And so I had a very emotive reaction because my oldest son was going to be away from me for the first time on a trip to Washington, D.C., and he looks older than he is. And I had a coworker ask me how I was doing, and I said, not well. And I said everything that I was feeling. And I know she was taken aback for a moment, but I had to be authentic in that moment. So I think authenticity is the most important thing about creating space for these conversations.
That is so important that you just said that. It took me back to a time here in Cleveland where a young boy named Tamir Rice was killed. And my son at the time was the same age as Tamir, and I had the exact same experience. My children play with toy guns. My children go to the local rec centers. My children could have easily been mistaken for someone who was older than who he was and had, some other situation happen to him. And I remember feeling that same sense of emotion, but still trying to cover it while you're at work. You have this fear for your family, but this, let me be professional at work. And being authentic in a work environment is challenging. No matter what your background, no matter what it is that you're dealing with, it is challenging. So I love this opportunity to just really be able to create a space for us to bring our whole selves to work, to be authentic, to not have to hide that. So tell me, in terms of some of the things that you have seen, how have you been able to help people in this environment, in this climate today, to really be able to adjust to some of the areas that we need to be authentic, but also need to be professional?
Yeah, Candace, I think that that's really important when you talk about having people with inside the organization that can share the fact that they have had these moments of vulnerability. It sometimes creates a space for someone else to recognize that there is a way to do it authentically, but also with professionalism. One of the analogies that I use often, Candace, is when we think about anything that we want to accomplish in life, maybe the same person that starts the task doesn't finish it. And I'll share the analogy this way. If I'm trying to, grow some sort of plant or thing, I might be the person that breaks the ground. Somebody else might till the dirt. Somebody else might plant the seed. Someone else might water it. And the sun is going to do what the sun does to provide it with that vitamin D and photosynthesis and help it grow. And so I believe the same sort of strategy can take place in terms of having these kinds of conversations within organizations. So look at what you all are doing with United Voices of Materion. You're breaking the ground. You're the first ones to bring together this type of format. But what I believe is that you won't be the last one to do that. And so what you're planting that seed now of creating space to have these conversations, it's also recognizing that everybody is going to be at a different place on this journey. And so I always encourage, especially, white folks that are asking me, how can I be a better ally? Or how do I just learn to understand what is going on? And one of the things I would suggest is recognizing that not every Black person that you know or every Black person that you work with may be at an emotional place to have these vulnerable conversations. And so sometimes when we poke and we ask, like, how are you doing? And somebody says, I'm okay, and move on. If we try and dig deeper, you might not get the reaction that you're anticipating. But that's also this level of vulnerability and transparency where we have to be willing to sometimes understand that someone might come off a way that's off-putting, but you don't know what else is behind that particular situation. And so I say you should give as much grace as you want to receive, especially around having these kind of conversations. I have some people that are just not the best at delivering the conversation. They may be better for some other part of the process later down the road.
And this is great. That actually addressed one of the questions that was submitted by one of our employees earlier regarding how can we have these communications in an amicable manner. And you just touched on that, being able to not necessarily poke and aggravate and dig too much, but just create that opportunity of openness, knowing that you are a listening ear, build that trust. And so that person feels comfortable coming to you and maybe eventually will share a little bit more. But you're right, this journey is emotional. I've been on the journey myself of understanding some of the things in our history and how we've gotten here. And I have had some very eye-opening moments, and sometimes I've even shed tears and cried and just been in so much pain to know that this is our American history. And so knowing that I'm a part of the future, that I can help make things different, make things change, that's where I get my hope from. That's where I see the millions of people that are working together so that whatever our history, as ugly as it has been, it doesn't have to be our future. So I wanted to...
Before you ask, I could just react to that, because I think something that you said is important. It's that Black folks are on a learning and a journey as well. And I think that oftentimes people perceive that we do know everything about everything that's happening, but our life experiences and where we grew up. So I came from Sacramento, California, and we were organized mostly by socioeconomic as opposed to racially. I moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and it became very prominent to me that like segregation was still a very real thing, because people in Cleveland are more organized by racial groups. And so when you're, depending upon where you grow up, you might not have the experience of like a Black experience that people might anticipate that a Black person has. And so if they're coming to you asking like, what was it like? And you're like, I don't know. I grew up in suburbia. I don't know what that experience is. So let's be aware that everybody is, again, on a different place. And some folks are also still learning more, to your point, about the history of how we got here when we think about what systemic racism actually means.
I love that. I love that. Absolutely. So another question from the employees in terms of people who have submitted questions sooner. How do you suggest that we can best create awareness about this topic in short conversations with the people that we know? Sort of like you mentioned, planting the seeds and letting the dialogue evolve from there. How does that even start?
I think there are a couple of ways. Number one, I say, like anything else you're doing, know your audience. And so understand the things that are likely to land well with somebody, especially if you think this person may be less open to a conversation. You're really trying to fill them out. I think that there are a number of things that happen in the media every single day that can just be talking, topics, so to speak. Something happens that you hear about that intrigues you. It can be a way to start a conversation. We also talked about some resources, and I think Candace might share towards the end of the presentation, but there are a number of books as well, and that can be a conversation point. If you've taken the time to read a book relative to equity, inequality, racism, any of these different topics, and you found something in the book that was interesting, you can use that as a conversation starter. I always encourage people to be intentional, because if you do something haphazardly, you might have a haphazard reaction. And so especially when you're thinking about these kind of conversations, oftentimes what's off-putting to people is you can tell somebody didn't really think through what they just said, and it's like, whoa, that didn't land well at all.
Yeah, the foot in your mouth moments, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, on the flip side, What would be your approach to keep racial equity on the front or on the top of the mind when dealing with our leaders, our executives in business and in this place of employment that we all go to on a day-to-day basis?
I think that's a great question. And it's one of the reasons that I started my consulting practice. It's because I believe that we have to look at racial equity, yes, from a social and moral perspective, but there is an economic imperative for us to get this right. And so I look inside of organizations and say, when we can start to address the fact that inequality makes us less efficient as organizations, it makes us not have the opportunity to have the best ideas, to not be able to see things from multiple perspectives. And so I think the way you keep it top of mind for business leaders is continue to tie the conversation back to the business. And so when you think about, I saw a number of folks that are in engineering or in other fields. One of the things, and I know Materion doesn't specifically do this, but we're seeing in artificial intelligence is the bias that is inherent in society making its way into new technology. And so thinking about the work that you all do inside of your organization while you supply parts that go on to, other people, just understanding what it would look like if the community inside of the organization was also representative of the community more broadly, and how you encourage business leaders to identify that you're likely missing out on new ideas from people that have never just been a part of the conversation and what that could do for the business.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we are seeing that across all genres. I as I mentioned earlier, I specialize in the campus recruiting space, and just being able to see the college students not only look ahead to their careers, but also look behind them to helping the high school students get prepared for some of those same things. And you see the companies and organizations and all kinds of donations pouring in, and this opportunity that. So there really is this effort to want to bridge that gap. And just really creating awareness that, one, it exists, and two, how can we fix it? So I love those collective thought processes coming together to help address that. Now, I do want to take a brief moment just to kind of insert, if you're on this call listening live and you have any questions that you would like Danielle to answer, feel free to put them into the chat. My team and I are monitoring the chat, so we'll be happy to address those and bring those up. I'm looking at the time. We're actually doing really good on time. So if you have any questions, feel free to submit them. In the meantime, Danielle, let's get back into some of the things that you had mentioned earlier about initiatives that not only the NAACP has done, but other groups have done. What have you seen that works? What are some ideas or some initiatives that you've seen that have really successful results to them?
I think the most successful, and I'll start broadly and I'll talk about a couple of specific examples, the most successful strategies start with the end in mind. And it's one of the things that we really have tried to impress upon people that have become activated after the murder of George Floyd. And even, I would say now, folks who are getting more activated even after the sentencing process or the trial process has kind of gone underway. You definitely starting with the end in mind is important because you see a lot of things that happen as an immediate reaction to something tragic that's happened in the community. But there are also these things that happen every single day, things that we call like microaggressions and issues that people have to kind of bring to the table. And so when you identify what you're trying to accomplish, then you can kind of develop all of the strategies that are necessary to get to that end result. And again, it's very similar to anything else that we would do in business. If we're trying to manufacture an end product, we have to know all of the necessary components to get to, our end goal and our finish line. And so with activism and advocacy, it's the same thing. So for example, if there is legislation that's happening in a specific place that the organization, let's say like NAACP, is not necessarily supportive of, then we not only are looking to potentially stop the legislation, but think about how we prevent it from being reintroduced and who the people are that are going to influence the ability for that legislation. So if it's the Speaker of the House or whatever that may be. Also thinking about like voting as a thing. We can march and we can protest, and we should, because those tactics help to create awareness that just having conversations behind the scenes often don't. And so I will always tell people, sometimes get frustrated with NAACP, like, Black Lives Matter is out and they're protesting and then in the streets every day. What are you guys doing? And I'm like, there's number one, our national president always says, there is no competition in social justice. There is enough work for all of us to have space to do this work together. And so organizations like Black Lives Matter are really effective at what we call direct action. And so they might take more of their strategy to being out in the streets, being physically visible and creating an environment where people are like, I have to pay attention to what's happening right now. The NAACP, we have focused our efforts primarily around mobilizing voters, because we understand that after we march and protest, or while we're marching and protesting, many times until the policy and the legislation is put in place that eradicates whatever the issue is, we're not going to have permanent victory. And so we like to do a lot of mobilizing voters. In addition, we do also bring lawsuits. And so we look at that process as well, which often takes longer. And that's why I say you got to start with the end in mind, because if you don't, after a very successful march, you could say we have victory, but then nothing actually changed in terms of policy. So organizations like Color of Change, the NAACP National Association, there's also another organization called the NAACP Education Legal Defense Fund. They do a lot of filing lawsuits. ACLU, these are great organizations that do a lot around protecting First Amendment rights and things like that as well.
Thank you for that. Just putting in that broad perspective, because you're right. I remember there were comments after last year. There was so much emotion, so much rage, so much just, what did we do when we took to the streets? And some of it was peaceful and some of it was destructive. And we felt like we did something because at least people were talking about it. But what did we really change? Especially as we saw a year go by and we saw more of the same thing happening. And so it was this sense of, we made all that noise, we did all of this, and it didn't change anything. And here you are helping to see that, yes, that strategy had a place, and it was great to create awareness and to have that conversation. But in order to get real change, you have to do more. And it does help to have, one, knowledge of who you're voting for, who those candidates are, who's in your districts. All of those things are great points. Thank you for that. We're beginning to get some comments in the chat, so I want to touch on these. So Maribel says that, Danielle, you mentioned equity and equality, and there's usually a misconception that they mean the same thing. For those not familiar with those concepts, can you explain and give a couple of examples of the difference between equity and equality?
Absolutely. So I think that what I always, my perspective on equity and equality is this: in order to get to equal, you generally need to have equity at play, because especially in a society that was founded inequitably, you had a whole population of people who were already occupying this land that were not treated like the folks that came and took it over. And then you had, slaves that were brought over that were not given the same rights. You had a constitution that didn't provide women with, rights. And so you have all of these different spaces where people were not provided the same equal access. They weren't provided the same equality. And so the only way you can get to actual equality, meaning that everybody is valued equally, everybody has the ability to have the same types of things, you have to address the fact that inequity does exist. And the only way you can displace inequity is by providing equity. So you got to give people the things that are necessary for them to just catch up. And I think there are a lot of different memes and visuals that you've probably seen out there. I know there's one that's pretty popular on social media where there's this family, or so to speak, standing in front of a fence trying to watch a baseball game. One is a small child, one's a medium-sized child, and one's an adult. And there are 3 boxes, and each of them have a box they're standing on. Well, the 2 children still can't see over the fence because everybody got the same thing. They have equalness, right? And there's equality because they all have a box. but equity is the person that's smaller needs more to be able to see over the fence. And so now the one has 2 boxes and another one has 1 box and they can see over the fence. And so that's a generic example, but I think when we look at in our lives practically, you start to have conversations about things like health disparity and people that live in communities that are polluted by environmental issues are going to have higher cost of medical care. And so equity would mean that if I know we're polluting your environment and the community that you live in, and now you have to go pay for medical care, there should be some way that that organization that's polluting subsidizes the fact that your healthcare costs more. And so those are conversations that continue to take place around what equity is necessary in all of these different systems where we know inequality and inequity exist.
You know, that brings to mind some comments that were made recently that have been gaining traction about the existence of racism or inequality in America. And I know that there are people who feel strongly on both sides, either in agreement or disagreement with those comments. But what you said makes total sense. It actually brings it all to light. And like we said, the very foundations of our country were not set in equality. There was a whole group of people that weren't even recognized as a whole person. In fact, the phrase is called 3/5 of a man. And so just knowing that that was the foundation. And so you fast forward hundreds of years, slavery is over. We have, you know, a release of these people and they're no longer in bondage, but economically, they weren't exposed to the same rights and the same privileges or even the same opportunities. They were restricted from jobs that could be held, the type of positions, the places they could live, the schools they could. And there was hundreds of years after slavery where there was an active inequality in play. And I think that in some cases, those laws that, and these were legal, mind you, these weren't just, you know, somebody's opinion. These were legal laws that allowed this to take place across all 50 states of America. In some places, those laws have just been removed as early as the 1980s, as late as the 1980s, I should say. And that's within all of our lifetimes. So I think it's important to note that some of this equality that we speak of, it didn't just start and end at a time period of slavery and bondage. It's been going on for years where many of not either us, our parents, our grandparents have lived through it. And this is what we are actively trying to not only bring attention to, but to rectify going forward. How do we keep future generations from repeating these same patterns and cycles? So thank you. That was an excellent point. There's another comment here from Lily that I want to share. She says, when talking about helping minority grow, Materion is full of talent. And Lily, you're right. I wholeheartedly agree with that. We have a lot of talent here. She says, we have resourced to start some outreach program to help providing some career education, science introduction to inspire high school students. She says herself, Lily, has been, she's been involved in a science fair mentor and judge for several years to support her local science fair. Her children, her boys, they started coding classes at a library to teach computer program. There are a lot of things that we can do to help close the gap. And Lily, you're absolutely right. I think Danielle even mentioned this in terms of taking the skills that we have, whether it be computer coding, marketing, sales, organizational skills, whatever skills that we have, critical thinking, these are skills that we can in turn use to help close the gaps in our community. I definitely see a need for that. And I know that there are organizations that help partner professionals with opportunities and nonprofits in their organization to do things like that. Let's go ahead and kind of take that a little bit deeper into the NAACP. What type of partnerships or what type of organizations have you partnered with that have helped to really create this equity or to really provide opportunities for future generations?
Yeah, so just picking up on this specific comment, the National Association has partnered with Google so this was 2020, I believe, the commitment was made from Google, but really to invest in resources for our AXO program, which is our Afro, Academic, Cultural, Technology, Science, Olympics. So we say ACT. So, and really the program is designed for students that are in the 9th through the 12th grade. There's a local competition, and if you receive a gold medal at your local competition, then you get to go to the national competition, and you have a chance to compete against students all across the country in like 30 different categories. So things like, STEM, there's entrepreneurship, there's performing arts, dance, drama, painting, visual arts, all types of things. And so thinking about the fact that like now we have a partnership with an organization like Google, this will create more opportunities for us to even thinking about things like coding and job placement and workforce development. One of the things that I always encourage people to think about is this notion of access, and then but people taking advantage of things that are accessible. And so I just had a conversation with one of the leaders at the Cleveland Public Library, and we're working on some things together now because she's like, Danielle, I'm disheartened by the fact that we have this resource, these multiple resources available in the Cleveland Public Library. But what I often see are suburban kids coming into the city to take advantage of these programs because some of the students are unaware that these things are here. So that awareness piece of access is so important. And then also sometimes it's a hurdle to recognize or believe that you should be coding or you should be an engineer or you should be a CEO if you have not had personal examples of those things. And I have a friend that always says, it's very hard to dream about something that you've never seen because dreams are generally an extension of something that you have encountered. And so if you've never, ever seen an airplane, you might have this thing in your mind, but you don't know what an airplane looks like. And so we have to also think about in some parts of our communities, one of the reasons we have such a hard time connecting the dots is because it's these conversations about coding and things like that are not even on the forefront of somebody's mind because no one in the household or no one in the immediate family is acclimated with the conversation to be able to encourage somebody to think about it in a way that would get them inspired to want to participate.
That is so true. I am so glad you touched on that. I see that even in recruiting with the college students. There are some who have been inspired to become an engineer because my dad is an engineer. My mom is an engineer. They work at a chemical company. I've tinkered with machines and building things in our garage, since I was a little boy. And there are some who I didn't know what else to choose, and I happened upon this. I'm good at math, and so someone suggested this for me. There is a very high correlation between seeing those in your home or in your family, in your immediate vicinity, and what you later grow to become. Even in terms of my personal life, my son is now studying to become an engineer because he was surrounded and mentored by other engineers. Not because I have an engineer in my family, not because I'm an engineer, but because this was something that he had a chance to be exposed to. So how many people in our communities, in our families, and in other areas of this country even just don't even know that these opportunities exist? We have titles in this company that I never heard of until I came here. For instance, metallurgical engineer. I never heard of it until I came here. And I considered myself to be, pretty well educated-ish. But to know that there are things in career paths that exist that tons of people just have no knowledge of because they're not exposed to. So I think that is really important. Thank you so much for bringing that to light. We've got another question here. So let's see. William Neeson. Hey, Bill. Thanks so much for this comment. It says, Lebo showed how apathy among whites and blame the victim paradigm are major obstacles faced by minorities. Is this an issue at Materion today? So that's a very big question. I would say that it is probably an issue worldwide for sure. Danielle, I'm going to have you speak on the worldwide in just a moment. But here at Materion, I would say that there are several areas that Materion can improve on within our diversity and inclusion efforts. We're not aware of all of them. I'm going to be frank with you. We know some, but we are not aware of all of them. We need people to speak up. We need you to say something so that we can begin to act to change. I have a quote in my signature line that has been there for a number of months, but it says, kind of paraphrasing from James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I've kept that quote up all year because I firmly believe that there are things that we can change and do better here at Materion. We're all active employees. We all have an opportunity to do something to improve and to make that change. But if we don't take that action, if we don't speak up and do something about it, it won't change. So Danielle, can you speak to some of the things that Bill mentioned in terms of the blame the victim paradigm, and that being just a major obstacle faced by people of color all across the United States?
Yeah, it's something that we know absolutely does exist. And I'm getting some feedback. I'm not sure if you are.
Oh, let's make sure everyone's on mute. I'm going on mute too. Go for it.
Okay. But yeah, it's something that absolutely does exist, and it's been one of the biggest barriers to advancement. The challenge is, I give you a very specific example. A friend shared on Twitter yesterday a specific thing that happened to her, I would call it a microaggression, being in a place in an environment where someone doubted that she belonged there, and someone else, a white female, responded and was like, I can't believe that happened to you. And so if it's 2021 and someone is sharing an incident of a discriminatory situation and someone else is saying, I can't believe that happened to you, and recognizing that, but these are the things that happen every single day. One of the biggest challenges that we have to advancement is oftentimes people don't believe it until they see it. They don't believe it unless they personally witnessed it or understand it in their own way. And it's sometimes the same thing that we think about when we're trying to get people to become allies. It's like, well, I don't really even know how big of an issue that is. And I think about, from my perspective, I have a great aunt who ultimately passed away this year, but she had a stroke a couple years ago. And so I always thought of myself as someone who's pretty open-minded and advocates for, yes, Black people, but I advocate for all disadvantaged populations, and thinking about people with mobility issues. So after the stroke, she was in a wheelchair or on a cane and things like that. But I became much more aware of how hard it was for someone who is not able-bodied to navigate, and the places that we would go where the door didn't open appropriately, or they didn't have the button to press and it would swing back on her, and I'm trying to guard the door and keep her from getting knocked over, or the bathroom stalls that don't have the bar rail and all of those things. And so I thought I was a great advocate for people who weren't the same able-bodied, but I became an even better advocate because I was faced on my front doorstep. And so I encourage people, especially as we're talking about what can someone who is white that doesn't feel like, I don't understand what you guys mean by systemic racism, or how could it possibly be that bad? You don't have to wait until you're in the shoes experiencing it to believe the things that people are saying, and don't be an obstructionist. The best thing that you can do is be supportive and go on the journey. And there are lots of, again, resources. I think Cast by Isabel Wilkerson is probably one of the best books that helps to break down how we got here, how our systems were built and designed. And I think it creates an easier way for people to acknowledge that this stuff is real. Nobody's playing the race card. It's not made up. Our systems were designed to be oppressive, unfortunately, and we've got to work collectively together to break them down.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. All of that was just spot on. I have to tell you that having firsthand experience of a situation, like you mentioned, being cognizant of your aunt's stroke and her limited physical abilities, and then having to move about in the world with that on her behalf or alongside of her, it definitely opened your awareness and your eyes so much more. But even mentioning the book Cast, so I'm in the middle of it now with a local book club here. When I tell you that I had known some of those things, again, I'm on this journey of learning America's history myself, and I considered myself to be well read, and this isn't my first book, but that was a very eye-opening read, and I definitely listed it in our resources. So I want to get to these couple of comments that I saw in the chat, and then we're going to get right into the resources so that we remain on time. So Cheryl Goodman, hey Cheryl. Cheryl says, I am increasingly seeing statistics spotlighting the educational divide, particularly the cost of college increases. The go-to for many companies of establishing a degree as a required part of your qualifications is increasingly posing a barrier for extremely talented individuals, particularly people of color. Factoring in life skills and leveraging the tuition reimbursement program while removing the degree as a requirement for consideration is uncomfortable for many hiring managers. What advice do you have for us on this subject? Good question, Cheryl.
Yeah, I think one of the organizations, large organization here recently did some of the same type of investigation, and they were looking at the hiring rate for minorities, and they made a simple change by eliminating the degree requirement, but they listed it as a preference and then listed the comparable type of skills that you could have. And they were able to hire people who were absolutely qualified, but they did get a more diverse pool as a result of eliminating the degree requirement. And I know sometimes people get frustrated. It's like, well, I went to college, I worked really hard, and I got my degree. Why should we be bringing on people that haven't worked as hard as me? And I think that it's a misnomer to think that someone that does not have a college degree has not worked as hard. Oftentimes, they have had to work harder in a different way because it's challenging to navigate systems that want specific boxes to be checked to minimize risk or to make processing and getting through systems easier. When I was first managing at MBNA, I didn't have a college degree. One of the reasons I finished my degree, I initially wanted to be a math teacher, and I decided I didn't want to teach math. And so I stopped going to school until I could figure out what I wanted to do, because I had too many older adult friends that I knew that had these college degrees and weren't using them in the field that they got them in. And so I said, well, I'm going to take a non-traditional path. I'm going to go back to work, and I'm going to do some things that I enjoy, and that'll help me figure out what I want to go to school for. And so I ultimately did that and finished my degree in finance. But when I first started in a management position, I was not a degreed person, but it was because I had been through internal programs inside the organization that helped the organization feel comfortable with my leadership and development, that I could lead in that space. And then as I was looking to progress further, I decided for myself, it made sense for me to go back and finish the degree, because there were some things that I didn't necessarily know just from, being someone who was self-learned and was willing to kind of read up on a number of different things. So there was value, but it helped me to not waste a bunch of money. And so I think organizations like Materion and others can think about what types of things can somebody come in non-degreed and do, and what types of internal programs can be available to help somebody learn and grow. I learned Excel inside of an organization. That was a professional development thing, because we used Excel a ton there. So I didn't have to go take it at a college course. It was afforded to me inside the organization because the company recognized how valuable it was to have more staff that could use the tool effectively. So think about what you can create inside the organization to fill the gap for someone that may be highly talented, but not quite where you need them to be.
That is an excellent point. Great comment. And I know that there are some departments, some locations that are doing just that. I'm really excited to see how Materion will take these type of initiatives to train internal employees, our internal resources, to help meet the needs and demands of where we're going for the future. And just to relate to your story about the non-traditional college path, I did the same thing. I did not jump right into college at the age of 18 after graduating high school. I took some time off. I thought I wanted to do massage therapy right after high school, and I'm really good. I mean, I made a couple of dollars, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't fulfilling me the way I thought I'd want it. And turns out I didn't actually get inspired to my career until I was about 24 years old. So I wound up starting college at 24 years old. I already had a family. I was already working full time. I didn't finish my degree until I was 30. And even then, there were still some outstanding debts owed. So my degree wasn't even issued when I graduated. I had to pay off those debts before they would even issue my degree. Even though I finished it within 6 years, I actually wound up getting it. The time that degree was actually issued to me was maybe at least 6 or 7 years later, when I could finally afford to pay off the debt that I owed. So it doesn't change who you are as a professional and who you are as a person with that piece of paper. So I definitely, I want to make sure everyone's on mute too if you're not speaking. But I definitely think that as hiring managers, we really do need to consider talent in other ways, in more traditional ways. We're down to our last 10 minutes, so I'm just going to summarize a couple of comments that I saw in the chat. Imani, thank you for your comment about helping another person who was onboarding in Buffalo really understand the benefits that Materion has to offer so that we can invest in our employees' future, whether it be 401k with matching services, tuition reimbursement, college scholarships, all kinds of things that we just may not even know exist, but Materion does quite a bit. So I definitely appreciate you for calling that out. Yannicka, I definitely hear you with the comments about wanting to hear these resources and being a person who's really looking to learn more. So let's get these resources shared with you as well. Let's go ahead and there we go. So on this slide, you will see that there are a number of books that I did not list, but some of the ones that Danielle and I have been talking about are specifically on this slide. And so one of the things that I want to point out is that I know everyone is not a reader, and some of these books are thick. We're talking hundreds of pages thick. So if you're not a book reader, it's okay. You don't have to sit down and commit to just a whole weekend of trying to read this book and learn as much as you can. I actually read most of these through audiobook. Audiobook allows me to wash dishes and listen to a book at the same time. I'm folding laundry and I'm listening to the book at the same time. So for those of us that, maybe reading just isn't your thing, you may want to try something like an audiobook version. But these are the books that were mentioned. Cast, The Origins of Our Discontent. I forgot to put who it's by, but her name is Isabel. She's the author of that one. Color of Law. Color of Law was life-changing for me. Color of Law was huge. It's written by Richard Rothstein. I would suggest that if you are new to your journey, Cast and Color of Law are the first two that I would immediately suggest starting with. They are just that important. White Fragility is written by Robin DiAngelo, and it really does help to examine some of the concepts and the hesitation in wanting to have discussions like this. How to Be an Anti-Racist, that was a very good one by Ibram Kendi. The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. This is the true story of how we have so many of our biological advances to this day off of the cells from an African-American woman that were taken from her without permission, used without her permission, and her family was never compensated. True story of American history, people. And of course, the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration in the age of color blindness. I love how Michelle really helps to talk about how this can't be racist because I don't see color. And so it really helps to put together this concept of color blindness and systematic incarceration, systematic racism, and how it disproportionately impacts other minority groups. So again, if you're not a book reader, guess what? That is not your only method of getting this information, people. You like streaming media? How about Amend on Netflix? I don't know how many of you have seen this, but it's actually hosted by Will Smith and several other American actors, not even all American. I think we have a couple of British voices in there. So it's just a lot of different people are helping to tell the story of America and its amendments to the Constitution. Amend is now currently streaming on Netflix. 13th, another documentary about the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, how it allegedly abolishes slavery, but not really. That is not only streaming on Netflix, but also YouTube. So keep in mind, if you don't have a Netflix subscription, YouTube is free. The United States versus Billie Holiday, not a true authentic documentary, but a great story and an oversight into some of the things that were going on in that period of time. My family actually grew up listening to Billie Holiday, and I never knew some of those things about her story. It now inspired me to want to learn more about her story, about who she was and how important her song Strange Fruit was and still is to outlawing something as heinous as lynching, which still has yet to happen, by the way. Breaking the Huddle on HBO. That's a story about football. So for all of my sports fans, if you're really into the history of the sport, or you like to know a little bit more about the sport, this goes in depth into the first integrated college football game. Yeah, that's going to be good. King, not kind, that's spelled wrong, apologies. King in the Wilderness is the story of Martin Luther King in his last 18 months of life. And then, of course, for my veterans, for Love of Liberty, the story of America's Black patriots. There's so much overlooked in terms of African Americans who served our country in the military, specifically World War I, World War II, and fought and died for this country only to come home to a country that discriminated against them. They were not given some of the same rights as the people that they fought and died next to. This is a more detailed account of that story, not the glossed over version that we may have heard in history, okay? So again, streaming media may not be your thing. I've got 2 podcasts up there. Podcast, Nice White Parents by Shauna Joffe-Walt. That is a podcast that goes in depth into a school system in New York City, but still present day, and it helps to acknowledge some of the history and the current discrepancies within education. And Behind the Police. A lot of people are unsure of which way to go when it comes to supporting police or reforming police or defund the police. There's so many different arguments and concerns out there. This takes none of those sides. Behind the Police really does go in depth to how did the police even start in America? How did it start in the world? Who were they originally meant to protect, and how did they get to where they are now? So these are just a few of the resources that I would recommend. Ones that I've taken part in myself. I'll be happy to have conversations with anyone about them. In addition to those particular resources, here's a group of organizations that you can follow. So the NAACP, as we mentioned, they have a national chapter. They also have local branches in each of the 50 states. There's over 2,000 branches. So that means there's likely one near you. If you're looking as to how to find it, just open the invitation that you use to click onto this link. There's a link to help you find the nearest NAACP branch near you. There's also the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, something that Danielle also mentioned, which is a way for you to donate or volunteer your times and services, either your skills as a lawyer or your skills in volunteering and research, or even volunteering, as I mentioned, your time and money. Color of Change is a great organization. I receive texts from them all the time, but also looking to make change on a nationwide scale. ACLU of Ohio. Of course, that is another really good one. I think we're actually going to plan another conversation around ACLU. So our next Exchange for Change conversation would likely have that, maybe as a teaser. And then the YWCA. I am a huge fan of the YWCA. Nothing like the YMCA. This is a little bit different, but they have really great initiatives as well around education, regarding inequality and support specifically for women. So as we near our time, thank you all for just hanging out with us, for talking with us, for sharing your comments, for listening to what we had to say. This is being recorded. It will be available on Materion Matters very soon. So if you want to come back and try and listen to it again to catch something you missed, if you want to share it with other colleagues who may have missed it, by all means, please do. I just want to leave us all with this quote from Gandhi: "Be the change you wish to see in the world." Thank you for your time and attention. Have a great day.
Thank you, Karen.